Real pleasure to be here. I work for FTN, which is part of First Tennessee. We're Memphis-based, but myself and my colleagues here are all in the New York office. This is very much like coming home. I guess I ought to give a little trigger warning here. There's a lot of Trump in the presentation. Here's the thing. Love him or hate him, and from what I've seen in the latest polls, there really isn't anyone in between. He is already having a significant impact on the economy. He will continue to. And in the markets, there is almost an obsession with all things Trump. My sense is that through the first quarter, that's going to continue. And then we get used to it, maybe, at which point it's going to make a bigger difference in terms of where the economy is at the end of this year anyway, and where the markets are. It will make a bigger difference what Congress can get done and what the Fed decides to do. It's probably a good idea to keep an eye on both of those institutions. The economy right now is on a pretty solid footing, and that's coming off of a difficult year. Growth in 2016 was the slowest since 2011. It's the first year since then that growth has been under 2%. But the turning point was the second quarter. Things have been getting better for a while. The president inherits a stable economy, and one that is looking quite a bit better than it was at the beginning of last year. I say that because last year I had a recession risk in 2016 of about 50%. Looking around at my colleagues at places like Merrill and JP Morgan, they also had recession risk about that high. And that was based on two things. The economy was losing momentum quickly, and the Fed was determined to raise rates 4 times. Well, the economy has regained its footing, and the Fed held off. They raised rates only once. I think one of the really interesting things about the Yellen Fed, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is that their forecasting ability is absolutely abysmal. I mean, they are so bad at forecasting growth, at forecasting inflation, and at forecasting the federal funds rate, which the Federal Open Market Committee, the people who are doing the forecast, they actually set that themselves. So they're essentially forecasting their own behavior. They are vindicated by the fact that once they get into those meetings and push comes to shove and they have to make a decision, they have made the right decision. More often than not. I think the Fed's guidance of rate policy last year was terrific. They underestimated how badly the economy was beaten up. They took a step back, and as a result, things are getting better. So let's turn to the slides. Let me explain what we're looking at here. That red line is GDP growth, which is a measure of output in the economy. The black line is final sales growth. That's a measure of demand in the economy. Demand peaked way back in the middle of 2014. What happened at that point is that oil prices collapsed. The petroleum economy, particularly in the Southwest, slowed dramatically. The number of oil rigs in the U.S. fell by about 80%. That had a huge impact on the GDP numbers. Investment in structures, for example, which include things like shopping centers, but also include things like oil pipelines, railroad infrastructure, roads, highways, and so forth, if they are privately funded. Well, that investment collapsed, and it collapsed mainly in the southwest part of the country. It took a while for producers to notice, and you'll notice if you look at the chart that the red line, that's GDP output, it peaked 2 quarters after demand peaked. And what that tells you is that manufacturers got a little over their skis, and we ended up with excessive inventory buildup. You can see the inventory contribution to GDP down on the bottom. A big part of the story the last year and a half was those manufacturers trying to get inventories back in line with the economy. And as they drew inventories down, GDP growth slowed more than output, more than demand, more than final sales. And we ended the year under 2%. But demand, that black line again, is actually steady and has been for a year. It stabilized quite a while back, and we've got 4 quarters where final sales growth was within 0.1% of 2. It's just it was a matter of getting those excessive inventories out, and then we could restart production again, and that's exactly what happened. The turning point being the second quarter. The third and the fourth quarters were better. So we look at the outlook this year, and the oil economy is coming back. There's not a lot of growth there, but there's a little, and a little growth is better than free fall for sure. We look at manufacturing, and it is also starting to reaccelerate. And in the meantime, the service sector of the economy has been in solid shape all along. We're on a good footing, and I've got a forecast of about 2.5% growth this year, and that's on the conservative side. I think if I had to guess which was more likely, is it going to underperform at 2 or will it overperform at 2.5? I'd say, or at 3 rather. I'd say 3 is the bigger risk. Looking at the components that go into GDP, you can really see the shift taking place on this chart. So all of those bars are quarterly contributions from different sectors. The blue one on top is consumers. Consumers dominate this economy. They account for about 2/3 of the growth in the U.S. And consumption slowed between the end of 2014 and the middle of last year. It is slowly coming back. And when I say slowly, I mean the low point was 1.6% growth, and we're now growing at 1.9%. I think the reason it's taking a while for consumption to turn is that employment growth has slowed, and wage growth is it's growing, which is good news. It's growing faster than inflation, which is better news, but it's still at the low end of historical experience. I suspect that's going to improve over the next year or so as well. And you can see the bars under the zero line, the ones that we're taking away from growth. The red one is inventories, and that's back to just about neutral now. And the gray one is foreign trade, and that's also back to about neutral. The trade deficit got pretty ugly last year, and that was a combination of a strong U.S. dollar, which makes U.S. goods more expensive overseas, but also recession in the emerging markets. It was mostly a response to a sharp slowdown in Chinese demand in 2015. The Chinese economy has stabilized, and hopefully that also should be less of a drag on growth going forward. Okay, so that brings us to Mr. Trump. I'm sure you all are aware of what the stock market did in the month and a half after the election in November. We, and by we, I mean we Wall Street types, got all excited about the possibility of tax cuts, about a reduction in red tape, and stocks took off because earnings were expected to take off and so on. all of this may still come to pass, but it takes a really long time to get stuff done in Washington. And in addition to that, in a recent trip, I was down in D.C. a week and a half ago and met with people on the Hill. And what you realize is that Trump is the unusual outsider president where neither party, at least in the halls of Congress, is claiming him as their own. So the message is sort of maverick meet the incumbents, and I think it's also important to note that while Republican control runs deep, there are more Republicans in governor's offices than we've seen in I don't know how many decades, and state legislatures, there's more control there as well. They've got both houses of Congress and the White House, but it's a narrow majority, particularly in the White House. I'm sorry, in the Senate. I'm from New York City. I've got 3 daughters, you know, that they push pretty hard. Dad, who is this crazy guy? Anyway, there's got to be some deal making if things are going to get through the Congress. And on top of that, Republican legislators have their own agenda. You know, there is a significant group of 70 plus in the House who are absolutely committed to budget balance, for example. They're not interested in tax cuts that don't have offsets, and that may make it more difficult to reach a deal. The legislative timeline. The other CRA is the first thing on the congressional agenda. What that is, it's the Congressional Review Act. Congress has the power to review every regulatory change that was made in the last 60 legislative days in the year of an outgoing president. So what that means, 60 legislative days, brings us all the way back to June. And in addition to that, it's not just, it turns out, regulatory changes that were announced after June, but anything that was announced before that, but the paperwork wasn't submitted to Congress until June, is also subject to review. Congress can reverse any of those changes, any of those regulatory changes, and then it becomes extremely difficult to reverse them again. If, say, Donald Trump were to leave and a Democratic president were to replace him, it would require an act of Congress to reverse those changes. So this is going to be the first major step in reversing some of the red tape that's holding the economy back. In their wisdom, the Republicans decided the next thing on the agenda ought to be the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That's not going so well in the sense that people are starting to get cold feet about taking away insurance without having a plan to replace it yet. They are working on one in the Senate. We'll see how that goes. But there may be enough Republicans wavering that even though they're doing it in budget reconciliation, which means they need a simple majority, they don't need 60 votes, may be tough to get it through. And, it doesn't help that the president is leaning on them pretty hard to have something to replace it with before they repeal it. I think it is potentially setting themselves up for a rather tricky situation where they've sunset, or they were planning to have it sunset in the end of 2018. And of course, there are midterm elections in 2018, and they don't necessarily want to make that the issue deciding elections. The 2018 budget reconciliation is likely to pass in the second half of the year. This is where any changes in the tax code are supposed to be. So if we get a corporate tax reform, an individual tax reform, it would be in the 2018 reconciliation. The first surprise, because I read everybody's research on Wall Street and everybody says we're getting a significant tax cut and it's coming in January. Goldman wrote that 2 weeks ago, and I figure, half of the economic advisors in the White House now were at Goldman 6 weeks ago, so they must know something, right? That's not the message I got in D.C. If it's in the 2018 reconciliation, it's not, first of all, going to be effective this year. It'll be effective next year. And second, while there is strong support for corporate tax reform, there are plenty of members of both parties who believe we are taxing corporations too much from a competitive standpoint. We do have the third highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. There's not a whole lot of support for personal tax cuts. And I think that could be one of the most interesting fights. On top of that, Orrin Hatch, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which is the committee to send any tax legislation to the broader Senate, Orrin Hatch believes, as a matter of principle, that Congress should never cut taxes through reconciliation. And he's made that position known. Dodd-Frank reform, obviously something the White House or the president talked about quite a bit on the campaign trail. If that's going to happen this year, it's going to be bipartisan. Now, there is some growing support for reforming Dodd-Frank, again, in both parties. Elizabeth Warren is sort of the voice of the Senate Democrats on this issue. She designed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The courts dramatically weakened that regulator last year. She may be willing to go back and reopen the legislation in order to save what was her, really pretty much her baby. On top of that, there is a sense, and Hillary Clinton mentioned this on the campaign trail as well, that the Dodd-Frank Act leans much too hard on community banks. And as part of a company that deals with 3,000 community banks, we list them among our customers across the country. I agree very much with that. So corporate tax reform is a bipartisan goal. And to illustrate why that is, this chart shows the effective tax rate. That is, as a percentage of profits, how much is the Treasury actually collecting? And you can see that from shortly after the rate went to where it currently is, the effective taxes collected have fallen from 36% to about 25%. When you look at the S&P 500, the 500 biggest, roughly, companies in the U.S., half of their earnings are outside the United States, and that money never comes back in, so we never tax it. We have a tax system that encourages companies to move offshore to avoid paying. And the idea is that by lowering taxes to, say, 20%, which is the average in the OECD, it removes some of that incentive, although you still have to figure out what do you do about a company that's located in Ireland, for example. The House thinks the way to address that is to have a border adjustment tax. So if Apple wants to locate in Dublin, that's fine. But when they sell products in the U.S., they pay on what they earn in the U.S. The same would go for truly foreign entities as well. In the Senate, there's not much support for that because they think it's too complicated, too difficult to explain. But the idea actually is pretty simple. Rather than taxing companies based on where they're producing stuff, you tax them based on where they're selling it. And it removes a major incentive for offshoring jobs. And I think when you explain to taxpayers, even if it's a little bit complicated in terms of we're incenting companies to have jobs here instead of outside the U.S., they get that just fine. As far as individual tax reform goes, I don't think you have to look further than the disagreement within the Republican Party to see where this thing could be derailed. For starters, Paul Ryan says it has to be revenue neutral. So if you're going to cut the brackets, then you have to make up for that by eliminating deductions. One of those deductions they want to eliminate is the state and local tax deduction. The three states that would be hardest hit by that are New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. California is the fourth. And, it's sort of a transfer, if you will, from the blue states to the red, which is why it's such a popular idea, I think, in the Congress right now. But that isn't going to be enough money to cover the cost of cutting taxes. And Paul Ryan says what he's calling Medicare reform is the way to close the gap. They would get rid of the current Medicare system, replace it with a $5,000 voucher. Donald Trump, in his usual understated way, says that is political suicide, which actually is probably about right. As I said, Orrin Hatch doesn't want cuts through reconciliation. So all they need to do to pass this law is find 10 Democrats in the Senate who are happy to sign the bill that kills Medicare. Probably not going to happen. So in D.C., what I'm hearing is corporate tax reform, very likely to take effect starting next year. It is going to be a true reform, not just cutting the tax rate, but also incentives to bring jobs and to bring headquarters back into the United States. Not a bad idea. Individual tax cuts, I don't think they're going to happen. What's really interesting about that to me is on recent trips into the Midwest, talking to people who are not necessarily in finance, in government, they're okay with that. They are far more concerned about the deficit than they are about keeping their money out of Washington. So if, and it is a big if, but if Congress can address the deficit, then cutting taxes isn't necessarily going to hurt anyone, or not cutting them. It won't necessarily hurt anyone politically. Turning to the Federal Reserve, we're going to see an awful lot of Janet Yellen and her fellow members of the Open Market Committee this year. As I mentioned, last year they were committed to raising rates 4 times. They raised rates once. This year they are looking at 3 rate hikes. I think, again, they're probably only going to raise rates once. But the risks are higher. And that is because last year, when you look at the critical meetings, there are 4 each year in March, June, September, and December, when they have a press conference. That tends to be when the rate changes. At those critical meetings, there was something really bad going on in the global economy until December, which is why they didn't hike rates the first 3 times. This year, things seem to be calmer in the global markets, so maybe they can get away with it now. I think Right now, what we're hearing that's key is that the belief that we're going to have a stronger economy, and the mandates coming from the White House, from Congress, to remove barriers to growth, well, those are reasons to raise rates unless we see an increase in productivity. And, well, we'll get to that in a minute. What you're looking at right here is the yield curve. And specifically, the yield curve changed since the day before the election. You can see interest rates are quite a bit higher, particularly in the middle part of the curve. Although since the beginning of this year, really since December 15th, those yields are coming a little lower. I think it's very interesting that the rise in rates is bigger in the belly of the curve than it was in the longest coupons. And I think that is an indication of the market's faith in the Fed's ability to control inflation. They might not be very good at forecasting, but they have proven terrific at keeping inflation in check.